What's up developers, and welcome back to a new video where we'll be building a property listing API in Laravel. Quick pause. I'm currently working on a new Udemy course where we'll dive into Laravel databases and Eloquent. If you think that there is a topic that should most definitely be included, feel free to drop it down below in the comment section. If you would be interested in the course or want to support the channel, make sure that you follow me on either Twitter, Instagram or YouTube to be the first one to find out when the course gets released. Keep in mind that this video is not for Laravel developers that have never worked with APIs. I won't be explaining every single step we're doing. If you are new and you want to learn APIs, I will link my Laravel API course from scratch, as well as my Laravel Sanctum API tutorial in the description down below. I just set up a default Laravel project and I want to walk through a property listing API step by step. So usually, the first changes I make within my application is setting up my database and database credentials in the .env file. I've got MySQL installed inside my CLI, so I can run the MySQL command, where I can perform a MySQL command to create a database. So let's say create database, and let's name it property _ listing _ API. Once you have created your database, you can perform an exit right here, and it's time to change up our environment credentials inside the .env file. So let's navigate back to PHP or any code editor. Open the .env file, and right here inside the DB section, you'll find the connection, which is good, host is good, port is good. My database name is equal to the database I just created, my username is root, and my password is very secret because it's starry1234. Now let's navigate back to iTerm because we can test out our migrations. We first need to change our directories into our property listing API directory, so our project, where we need to perform the PHP artisan migrate command, which will show us that the tables have been migrated into our database. I recently created a tutorial where I created a complete Laravel Authentication API using Laravel Sanctum. Now I don't want to build it once again in this video, but I do want to use the authentication system in order to protect certain routes within the application. So what I want to do is quickly copy pasting certain files from GitHub into my current project that I created with Laravel Sanctum. The GitHub repository will be linked in the description down below. In case you are not interested in adding an authentication system, feel free to skip to the next timestamp. First, we need to create an authentication controller through the CLI by performing the PHP artisan make controller command named auth controller. Let's then quickly navigate to my GitHub repository inside Google Chrome, open the app directory, HTTP, controllers, and let's open the auth controller where you can copy it through these two square icons or boxes, navigate back to PHP, open the same app directory, HTTP, controllers and our auth controller, select the entire file and paste it right here. If we scroll up, you'll see that we have a couple errors right here or warnings. And the first one is the HTTP response right here, which is a custom HTTP responses trait that I created, which will either send back a success or error message to the browser. So let's create it as well. Inside our app directory, we're going to create a new directory. Let's name it traits, where inside our traits directory, we're going to create a new file, HTTP responses.php. Now let's navigate back to GitHub. Now let's go back into our app directory, traits, HTTP responses, copy it, navigate back to PHP and paste it right here. Now if we open our auth controller one more time, you'll see that the HTTP responses error is gone, but we do have our login user request and our store user request, which is still throwing an error. So let's navigate to the CLI and let's create two requests. Let's say PHP artisan make me a request named login user request. Then we're going to hit the arrow up because we're going to perform the command one more time with a different name called store user request. What these two files does is simply validating the incoming user email and the password. So let's navigate back to Google Chrome, app directory again, HTTP, requests. Let's copy the login user request, navigate back to PHP, open the same request directory, login user request, paste it right here. We need to do it one more time for the store user request. Navigate back to PHP, replace the entire file, and we're ready right here. The last thing that we need to add are obviously our routes. Now, whenever you want to work with API routes, you need to open the routes directory where you have a api.php file. We're not going to work with the web.php file because only web routes will be stored right there. When working with APIs, you have the api.php file. Now right here, we're going to define two quick routes and I'm not going to copy them. Let's say route get. The endpoint will be /login coming from the auth controller, the class. The method is login, and we're going to duplicate this line of code, and we're going to change method inside our auth controller to register. The endpoint will be register. We're also going to work with protected routes. And protected routes are routes where you need to be logged in before you could use them. At the moment, our auth controller has one method at the bottom, which is the logout method. And you can only log out a user once a user is logged in. So this needs to be a protected route. And we're going to do this for our property API as well. Only logged in users can create, delete, or update a property. Users that are not logged in can obviously see the properties, but they cannot do anything with it. So let's define a protected route. Add a comment right above the other two. So these are public. So let's call the route method, chain the group method to it. The group method has an array as a parameter where we're going to pass in the middleware, which is equal to another array because it's the auth Sanctum middleware. Then it has a callback function, so function parentheses curly braces, where we need to define the routes in here that are protected. So in our case, we're going to add the route, which is a post method. And excuse me, the login and register method are both posts. The endpoint will be logout. The controller will be the auth controller as well, but we're going to call the logout method. Now that we have added all files for user authentication, I want to quickly navigate to Postman, where I want to create a new workspace. I'm going to rename the workspace to Property Listing API. Now let me zoom in. All right. Then inside our collection, we're going to add a new request with the name of register new user. Let's save it. It's going to be a post request. The URI will be property-listing-api.test/API. And keep in mind that whenever you work with API, the /API prefix is required. Let's finish the route and I'll show you why. /register. There is a possibility to change up the /API endpoint, but then we need to navigate back to PHPStorm, search for the route service provider, where we have right here a route middleware called API, which will add the API prefix on all routes inside the app.php file. If you want to change it, feel free to do it right here. I'm going to keep it as it is, so let's navigate back to Postman and let's define our first request. Inside the headers tab, we need to add two key value pairs, which are required when you want to work with APIs. The first key is accept, while the key is the application, the vnd.api plus JSON. The second one is the content-type, while the value is exactly the same. So let's copy paste it. Then we have another tab, which is the body tab, where you will basically add key value pairs, which will represent the request data. So you can see the body tab as basically a form on the front end where a user can add data through input fields. You can decide to either choose form data or x-www-URL encoded, which I prefer, where we're going to add 4 key value pairs to register a user. The first one is email, which has a value of my email. It has a name, which is equal to Dari. It has a password, test1234, and it has a password _ confirmation, which is test1234. Now, once we click on send, you'll see that we have an error message because the key name is a capital N, excuse me. Click on send one more time. It responded back with a status saying that the request was successful, a user has been created inside our database, and a token has been generated as well. Now, I'm not going to test the /login and logout endpoint. This was just basically to show you what we could do. Now that the authentication part is out of the way, we're ready to start off with the property listings. The next logical step right here is drawing out our database structure. So let's navigate back to iTerm because we need to create our migration first. But before we work on our properties migration, let's take it a step back. Every property listing has its own broker. So we need to make sure that we create a model and a migration for our brokers by saying PHP artisan make me a model called broker, and let's add a -m flag to it. Now this command has just created a new migration and model for us. Let's navigate back to PHP Storm, and we're going to focus on our migration first. And let me actually close off all tabs right here. Now migrations live inside a database directory, migrations, and it's always the latest one. Right here, you'll see that we have a schema builder, which will create a table called brokers. Keep in mind that a broker is not the same as a user inside our application. A user can create brokers and houses, while a broker is an object with a name, phone number, address that will represent a specific listing. Think about the listing site. Usually, you have a section somewhere at the bottom which will represent the broker of the property, which you need to call in order to get in touch. Now our broker has a name, so let's create a new column with a name of name, and it's required. Now a broker also has an address, so let's say table string, which will be the address, which is required as well. An address is basically in a city, so let's say table string city, which is required. It has a zip code, so basically, which is required as well. Then it has a integer, which will represent the phone number. And you can make this a string as well if you want to use the country code or the zip code with a plus sign, but I'll just keep it as an integer, which is required as well. Let's say that we have a string, which will represent the logo path of the company, which is required as well. Now a couple fields right here should be unique. Think about the name, the zip code, and the phone number. It's not possible to have multiple brokers with one phone number, right? Now there are two options that we could do right here. We could either chain the unique method like we did with the required method, or we could go right below our timestamps and define a new table object and call the unique method. Whenever you have one item right here that should be unique, you can simply pass in, let's say name, but we have 3 right now. So what we could do is pass in an array where we can add 3 keys that are unique. So let's say the name, the zip code, and also the phone number. Now before I forget it, let's quickly make sure that we add the fillable property inside our broker model, since we are going to mark all fields right here for mass assignment. So let's open a model subdirectory and the broker.php. Right under our has factory trait, we're going to define a new protected fillable, which is equal to an array, where we're going to pass in all the fields that we defined right here. So let's say the name, we have the address, we have the city, we have the zip code, the phone number, and we also have the logo underscore path. All right, what's next? Well, now that we have defined our brokers, we should definitely define our properties next. So let's navigate back to the CLI and let's run the PHP artisan make me a new model called property, and let's add the -m flag to it. Just like the brokers, we're going to start off with the migrations first. So let's navigate back to PHP Storm. Let me close off all files and let's open the latest migration. Every property that's going to be created inside the database needs to be assigned to one broker. So let's create a foreign key constraint right here by adding an unsigned big integer with the name of broker underscore ID. Now every property has its own address, which is a string. Then we have a table, which will be an enum, which is pretty new in PHP, where the column name will be listing underscore type. And the enum is mostly used to improve your code quality. It is pretty useful when you have a variable which our listing type is, which can take one of many values. So the listing types are pretty much static, right? Because there are certain types of listing types a property can have. So you don't want to give a user the option to add them themselves. But we're going to focus on this enum right here once we're done with our migration. After our enum, let's define a new table, which is a string, which will be the city where the property is located. We have another string, which will be the zip code. Then we have a description of the house, which will be a long text of description. We have the year that the house is built, and we could use the timestamps, but keep in mind that it's basically whenever the row inside a database has been created. So what we want to do is pretty much chain the year method to it, which will represent the built year of the home. Now right below our timestamps, we need to make sure that we define our foreign key constraint for our broker ID by using our table object, chaining the foreign method to it. The foreign key inside our list right here is the broker underscore ID. Then we can chain the references method to it because it references to the ID on our brokers table, so to this column right here. Then we can add the on method by saying it's on the table brokers. Finally, we want to delete it on cascade, meaning that once a broker gets deleted, the house gets deleted as well, which can be done by chaining the cascade on delete method to it. Now, just as the brokers, a couple fields right here are unique, which is first off the address, which will basically be the title of the house as well, and also the zip code, because one house has one zip code. So let's say our table object, chain the unique method, pass in an array because the address is unique, and also the zip code. Now let's also define our enum before we move on. Now Artisan doesn't offer a command to generate your enum because it's fairly new. So we need to create our enum manually. Inside our app directory at the top, we're gonna create a new directory with the name enums. And then in here, we're gonna create a new file with the name of listing type enum.php. Now, quick note, whenever you want to use enums, your PHP version needs to be 8.1 or higher, since PHP only started supporting enums recently. Let's start off by creating our PHP tag. We need to define a namespace, which will be app/enums. Then we need to define our enum by calling the enum keyword, followed with the enum name, which will be equal to the file. So let's say listing type enum. We're going to type hint it by saying :string. Now it's still throwing an error right here because I need to change my PHP version inside my composer.json file, which PHP Storm can do for me. Inside our enum, we need to define a couple cases, like you are probably familiar with. So let's say the case number 1 is called open, which is equal to a string of open listing. Then we have another case, which is sell, which is equal to sell listing. We have another case, which is called exclusive, which has a string name of exclusive agency listing. And the last one is the case called net, which is equal to net listing. Now here comes the tricky part. The enum method that we're calling inside our table object right here is throwing an error. And that's because it needs a second parameter, which should represent the available options. But since we have already defined a value inside our enum, it's a little bit overkill to basically pass in an array right here and a couple strings. So what we could do is hit enter right here and make a call to our listing type enum. So let's do that. As you could see, we could get the options right here. We have net, open, exclusive, or sell. So let's start with open. And we need to make sure that we chain the value method to it, which will get the value, so basically the string part, right here of our enum option. So we need to do this 4 times in total. So let's duplicate the line, while the second one is called sell. Then we have exclusive, and the last one is not open, but it will be the net option. I'm also going to chain one more method to our enum method, which is called default. We have a listing type enum value of open by default. Now the data that we have right here isn't enough when it comes to a property. And I don't want to make this migration enormous. So I do want to create a second migration model which will represent the characteristics of a property. Think about the number of bedrooms, the square feet, and so on. So let's navigate back to iTerm. Let's say that we want to create a new model. named property characteristic, and we're going to add the -m flag to it. It has created our model and migration. Let's navigate back to PHP Storm, and let's quickly open our new migration, which will create a new table called property characteristics. Now this table right here doesn't have its own unique ID. It's not necessary, but it rather has a property ID, since the data will always be used for one single property. So let's remove the ID and let's add the unsigned big integer method to it, which is property_ID. It's also going to be unique. Now let's define a couple property characteristics. The first one will be a data type of float. Column name is price, and this one is required. Then we have a integer, which will represent the number of bedrooms in the house, which is required as well. Then we have the bathrooms, which is also an integer. Let's say bathrooms, and it's required. We have another table, which will be a float, which will represent the square feet, which is also required. Then we have a table data type of float and a column name of price_square feet, which is required. Then we have an enum, so let's say table enum, which will represent the property type. We're going to fill it up later. Let's follow on because we have a second table enum as well, which will basically represent the status of the home, whether it's in sale, whether it has been bought, and so on. And this one is required. Then we have our timestamps, but right below that, we need to create a foreign key constraint to our properties table by saying table. The column property ID is foreign, references the column ID. On the table properties, and once one property gets deleted, cascade all property characteristics as well. We need to define our two enums before we're ready to migrate it. So inside our enum subdirectory, we're going to create a new file with the name of property type enum.php. We're going to create one more, which will be called property status enum.php. Let's copy our entire listing type enum. Let's paste it inside the property type enum, where we need to change our property name. And right here, we're going to pass in just 4 property types of a house. The first one will be single. The second one will be a townhouse. The third case will be a multi-family. And the last option is a bungalow. Let's change up the string value. So let's say single family home. Let's call the second one a townhouse. The third one will be a multi-family home, while the last value is a bungalow. Now let's copy the entire file, close it, open our property status enum. Let's change the enum name to property status enum, which will basically represent the status of a house. Even if a house is sold, we can keep it inside our database, but it can't be bought anymore. So let's change the first case to sold, where the string value is sold. The second option will be sale, so that people are still able to see the listing. So it's on sale. And the third option is hold, which basically says that it's almost sold, but the paperwork needs to be done first. So let's add a value of on hold right here. We don't have a fourth option, so let's get rid of that. Now, using enums isn't the most effective way when it comes to Postman, but keep in mind that Postman is just a useful tool for backend developers. In most companies, you build up the API as a backend developer so that frontend developers could interact with it. Using enums will make the frontend of an application a lot smoother, since you could simply create a drop-down menu which will show the enum options. With Postman, that's not possible, since we only have the option to work with key value pairs. So keep in mind, the reason why we use enums in APIs is not for us, the backend developers, but simply to make the life of a front-end developer that's going to fetch data from this API a lot easier. Now let's navigate back to our property characteristics table, because we need to pass in the options of a property type. So let's add a comma array. And like I've mentioned before, we could pass them in statically right here, but I want to get the value from my enum by saying property type enum, and we're going to get the single option. We have the second option, which is the townhouse. Then we have the second option, which is the townhouse. The third one will be a property type of multifamily. And the last option will be our bungalow. Right now, we have told our enum column that only these 4 options are allowed to be added into the database. Now let's do the same thing for the status. Let's add a comma array, and we're going to add the first option, which will be sold. The second option is sale, while the last option is the hold option. All right, we're done with our migration. Let's quickly define the fillable properties for our property and property characteristics model. So let's start off with the property, where we're going to define a new protected fillable property, which is equal to an array, where we're going to pass in the broker ID, address, listing type, the city, the zip code, the description, and the build underscore year. The same thing needs to be done for the property characteristics. So let's define a protected fillable, which is property underscore ID, the price, the bedrooms, the bathrooms, the square feet, the price square feet. Then we have the property underscore type, and we have the status. We are ready to migrate our migrations. So let's close off all files that we have. Navigate back to iTerm and perform the PHP artisan migrate command. Now I'm connected to a database client and I want to add a new row inside my database. So let's navigate back to PHP Storm, open the database client, brokers table. All right, let's add a new row. Since we're going to start off with showing a broker and not creating a broker first. Now the ID will be auto-generated. Let's add a broker name of Dari. The address is address. The city is city. The zip code is just a random number. Phone number. The logo path is test. And let's add the timestamps. Now once I submit it inside my database, you'll see that we don't have an error message. And we're ready to start working with a controller right now, which will be a resource controller. When working with APIs, we won't be using all resource routes. So let's define a controller with the resource flag and let's just remove the methods that we don't need. Let's navigate to the CLI and create a controller for our brokers by saying PHP artisan make me a new controller. Let's name it brokers controller and let's add the -- resource flag to it. All right, let's navigate back to PHP Storm. Let's close off our enums directory. Let's clean it up a little bit. All right, let's open HTTP controllers and our brokers controller, and let's scroll through it and remove the methods that we don't need. We will be using the index method to show all brokers. We won't show a form to create a new resource, so let's delete this one. We will use the store method, which will store a new resource or simply a new broker. We do need the show method, which will show one broker. We don't need the edit form, but we do need the update method, which will update one specific broker. And we also need the destroy method. Now let's scroll up and let's start at the top inside our index method, right here. Now you don't want to directly return the broker model and get all values. And let's actually define a route and I'll show you what I mean. Let's scroll down, open the API.php file. Let's define a public route first by saying route, : And since we're working with a resource controller, we could add the API resource method right here. Keep in mind that the default resource method is used for web routes, which means that the two methods we just deleted, so the create and edit, will be defined inside our app. Now the API resource method deletes that by default. Then we need to pass in an endpoint of brokers, and we need to pass in the controller, which will be the brokers controller, : class. Now let's navigate to the CLI for a moment and let's run the PHP artisan route list command. Now let's scroll up because right here you'll see that it has a get method to the index method to get all brokers. You can store a new broker with a post request. You can get one specific broker with the show method. We can update one through the update method, and we can delete one. So the create method and the edit method have been deleted through the API resource method. So let's navigate back to Postman. Let's save this request. If we then duplicate our request, you'll see that inside the headers tab, the accept and content type have been added by default. So we need to rename our request to get all brokers. The method will be get. The endpoint will be /brokers. The header tab will be accept and content type. And once we click send to perform our request, you'll see that we got our user that we created manually to our database client. Now this works fine, but the data that you are seeing right here comes directly from the database. Laravel allows you to create a resource class, which allows you to create a uniform format for the response. At this moment, it's returning a collection, and we don't have any control over the data. Now, if we have a relationship right here, it won't be visible. Laravel allows us to create a resource class. With the use of a Laravel resource, you add more structure to your request. This also helps front-end developers, or even back-end developers that might be using your API. Now, whenever you want to define a resource, you need to use artisan for it, by performing the PHP artisan make resource command, and we need to define it by saying brokers resource. Once we hit enter, our resource has been created successfully, and if this is the first resource you are creating, artisan will create a resources subdirectory right here inside the app directory, where it has added the brokers resource class. By default, every resource ships with a toArray method, which is used to return data related to your resource. Now we will be removing the return statement right here, and we're going to pass in an array. Right here, we could pretty much build up the response however we want, which will output it inside our body. So let's go inside of it. And right here, we need to pass in key value pairs. The keys can be whatever you want. So let's say ID. Then the value will be passed in whenever you make a call to your broker's resource. Now let me show you what I mean. Let's navigate back to our broker's resource and let's get rid of the broker all. We're going to return the broker's resource, which will return a collection. And what we're going to pass in right here is basically the broker model, where we're going to get all brokers. And let me change the return type. Now, the model that we're passing in right here can be used inside our broker's resource to the global this keyword, which we can then use to grab the ID. And this is happening because the broker that we're sending through is globally available. Now this needs to be done for all the fields that we have. So let's say the name, which will be this name. We have the address, which will be this address, the city, the zip code, the phone number, which is this phone number. And finally, we have the logo underscore path, which will come from this logo underscore path. Now, let's navigate back to Postman and let's send our request one more time. And right here, you will see a slight change. Our broker's model is wrapped inside of a data, which is called a member. And the data member is pretty much the most important member that will contain the primary data of the document, which has been created through our resource. Let's navigate back to PHP Storm. Let's close our broker's resource, route as well, and let's focus on the store method. Right here, I don't want to make use of the request facade that you see right here, but I want to create my own custom request for storing brokers. And there's also nothing wrong with validating incoming requests right here. Personally, I think that the controller should only handle requests from the route and return an appropriate message. Therefore, I prefer to work with requests, since it will divide the validation from the controller. Now, whenever you want to create a request, you need to navigate to iTerm and run the PHP artisan make a request command. And let's name it store broker request. Now let's navigate back to PHP Storm. Let's open the request subdirectory where we have our store broker request class. First, we need to set the return value of the authorized method equal to true. And this is something I forget quite a lot. And this will basically tell our controller that the user is authorized to make this request. Then at the bottom, we have the rules method right here, where we could return an array of rules that will check the incoming data from Postman. So let's do that. Let's add a check for the name, which will be equal to an array, where the option is required. It's unique on the table brokers, and it has a maximum amount of characters of 255. Now the address is required as well, and it has only a maximum amount of characters of 255. We have the city, which is required. Then we have the zip code, which is required. We have the phone number of a broker, which is required. It's numeric, and it has digits up to 10. Finally, we have the logo underscore path, which will be required as well. Now that we have defined our store broker request, we are ready to implement it inside our broker's controller, which can be done by replacing the request facade with a newly created request called store broker request. Now this doesn't magically check whether the data is correct or not. Inside the method, we need to make use of our request object and make a call to the validated method. With this one line of code, all validation from our store broker request has been implemented inside the store method. We could even test it out. Let's navigate back to Postman. Let's save our request. Let's duplicate the get all brokers request. Let's rename it to create new broker. The endpoint will be /API/brokers. Since we're going to persist data to the database, the HTTP method needs to be post. Once we click on send, you'll see that we have more than 5 errors because all these fields are required. Now, whatever we define after our validation doesn't matter, since the fields are missing and it's throwing an error. Now let's make sure that we store a user and send back a response before we perform a successful request. So once a user passed the validation, we're ready to define a new broker inside our database. So let's call our broker model and let's call the create method. Let's pass in an array because we have quite some fields that we need to fill in. The first one is the name, which will come from the request name. Then we have the address, which comes from the request address. We have the city, which comes from the request city. Zip code as well. We have the phone number, which comes from the request phone underscore number. And we have the logo underscore path, which comes from the request logo underscore path. And excuse me for this typo right here. Once we have created our broker, we are ready to return a response by saying return a new broker's resource. And let's pass in the broker that we just created right here. So let's test it out. Let's navigate back to Postman. Let's add a body. The first one will be a name with a name of test2. The second value is the address, which is test2 as well. Third one will be the city, let's say test2. Then we have the zip code, which will be test2. Sorry for all the fake data, but it's just too much work to add actual data right here every single time. Then we have the phone number. Keep in mind, it needs to be 10 digits. All right. And finally, we have the logo underscore path, which will be test2. Once we perform the request, you will see that the validation passed this time, and it has created a new broker since the ID is equal to 2 right here. All right, now let's focus on the next method. And this is probably the easiest method right here. Since we do not need to validate anything, we simply need to make a request to the database to check whether the user with a specific ID exists. But before we can do that, I'm gonna refactor the method a little bit. Laravel allows us to pass in an entire model as a parameter, rather than the ID that you see right here. This saves us one step, since you don't need to perform the where statement to see if a user with a specific ID exists. The beauty of Laravel is right here. since it will do that for you behind the scenes if you change the argument ID to the broker model and create an object called broker. Instead of defining a new variable, we can then directly return our new broker's resource and pass in the broker that we get from the ID. So what it will do is grab the ID that we passed in right here. It recognizes, all right, an ID has been passed in. Let me get the entire broker model, which we can then pass directly inside our return statement. If we navigate back to Postman, save our request, perform it. Well, we're actually not going to update one. It's show a broker. I'm not sure why I said that. It's a GET request. If we send it, you'll see that we got information of one specific broker. Now, the next method is the one that I actually wanted to do, which is the update method. Right here. All right. And just like showing a broker, we're going to replace the ID with the broker model and pass in one single broker object. Then through our broker object, we have direct access to the update method. And here comes another pretty cool feature of Laravel. In Postman, or even from the front end, users can add as many input fields as they want. If we try to update the request through the all method right here, it will try to upload all values, even if we haven't got a column for it inside the database, which is pretty tricky, right? Always keep this in mind. Users are guilty until proven innocent. Therefore, I recommend using the request object on it, but instead of chaining the all method, we're going to use the only method, which accepts an array where we could add keys that we can grab from the request. So let's say that it can only use the name, the address, the city, the zip code, the phone number, and the logo underscore path. Whenever a user adds another field that doesn't belong right here, our request will just ignore it. Now, once our request has been updated, we're ready to return a new broker's resource, and we're going to pass in the updated broker. At the moment, we're having a small issue. We're not validating any incoming data, and we can't use the store broker request since we have said that fields are required right there. And it is obviously not required to update all fields whenever a user makes a request to this endpoint. We could either create a new request or we could update the current one. And let's actually do that. Let's navigate to our store broker's request. And let's define a new method at the bottom called private function is post request. And what this method does is basically checking whether the request is a post request or any other request. So let's make a request to our request method, which is a global method that we could use. And let's chain the is method to it. Now we're going to check whether the request is a post request. If it is, print out a string of required, else print out sometimes. So whenever we try to create a new broker, it will check whether the request is a post request. If it is, it will print out required. Once it isn't, and it is a put request, it will print out sometimes. Now this allows us to basically modify the required field that we have right here by saying this is post request, which we need to change for all fields down here as well. So let's quickly replace it. And this basically allowed us to not create a new request. So let's navigate to Postman. Let's duplicate the request. Let's rename it to update one broker. Well, we need to save this one first, excuse me. The method will be put. We're going to update the broker where the ID is 1. Inside the body tab, let's actually uncheck the address, zip code, city, phone number, logo path. And let's change the name to code with Dari. Once we submit the request, you will see that the user where ID is number 1 has an updated name of code with Dari. Now this video is already taking a little bit too long, so I want to move on to the last method inside our broker's controller, which is the destroy method right here, which is pretty straightforward. We're going to replace our argument of ID with the broker model. We can use our broker object and call the delete method, which will basically destroy the broker. Then we need to make sure that we return some kind of message to the user because we can't show the deleted broker. So what we can do is returning the response method and chaining the JSON method to it. Then inside the JSON method, we could pass in an array where we could pass in 2 key value pairs. We're going to tell the user that the request was successful, but we're going to add a message as well, which says that the broker has been deleted from the database. Let me update my return type. All right. If we navigate to Postman, let's create a new request where the name will be delete one broker. The HTTP method will be delete. We're going to delete the broker where the ID is number 2. And once we click on send, you'll see the message saying success, and the broker has been deleted from the database. Now this was it for our brokers controller, but at the moment, everyone is able to make this request. So let's make sure that we protect these routes so that only users that are logged in are allowed to make them. Let's navigate back to PHP Storm, and let's open our API.php file, where we're going to move our API resource route inside our protected route, but we're going to say that only the store method, the update method, and the destroy method are protected. And let me actually outline it on the line below. But this does leave 2 options open, the index method and the show method. Now I want to make these 2 routes public. So let's say route, :get, the endpoint is /brokers, the controller will be the brokers controller, the class, followed with a method of index. Let's duplicate the line because the second one is the show method, where the endpoint will be /brokers, a specific broker. If we then navigate back to Postman and try to get all brokers, you'll see that we are indeed able to get one broker, but if we try to create a new broker and submit it, you'll see a message saying that we are unauthenticated. And this is happening because the store, update, and destroy routes are all protected right now. Now let's focus on the last controller, which will be the properties controller. And I will cover the parts that are similar to the brokers controller relatively faster. I won't be explaining all topics since the properties controller focuses more on the relationships and updating related tables. So let's start off by creating our controller right inside of the CLI, where we need to perform the PHP artisan make a new controller called properties controller, and let's add a -- resource flag to it. Let's navigate back to PHP Storm and let's open our controller and let's clean it up first. We do need the index method. We do not need the create method. The store method is alright. The show method is alright. The edit method needs to be deleted, update, and destroy. Then we need to register the routes inside the API.php file. We're gonna start off with a public route, and right at the end we will put them inside a protected route. Route, API resource, the endpoint is properties, and the second param is not an array, but it is the properties controller and the class. Now let's navigate back to our properties controller, and let's start off at the top inside of the index method. Well, we're actually not gonna add anything right here because we're gonna create our resource first. So inside iTerm, let's say PHP artisan make me a new resource called properties resource. Now let's navigate back to PHP Storm, open our properties resource, scroll down to the toArray method. Let's return, an array, but we're gonna start off by passing in the ID, which we will type hint to a string, and we're gonna pass in this ID. And based on the JSON API specifications, we should define an attributes member right here. And attributes on a resource object are just like the attributes on your model in Laravel, where you simply need to place data like the address, city, zip code, and so on. Any member inside the attribute member can be whatever data that represents the specific object, but it cannot be a relationship. So let's start out by defining an attribute section right here, which we will set equal to an array. Then right here, we're simply gonna add the address, which will be this address. We have the listing type, which will be this listing type. We have the city, which is this city. We have the zip code, which is this zip code. We have the description, which is this description. And we have the build underscore year. Oops, I keep forgetting adding the pointer. Now let's make sure that we add a property inside our properties table right here. So let's add a new row. Let's say broker ID of 1. The address is property 1, and let me actually copy it. The listing type is 1. The city is property 1, zip code as well, the description as well. The build year is 2004. Once we submit it, you'll see that we have a new property inside our database. And we're ready to send back a response inside the properties controller inside of the index method. So let's say that we want to return the properties resource, the collection, and we want to pass in the property model, all. Now this should show one property. Let's navigate back to Postman, duplicate our latest request, rename it to get all properties. The method will be a get request. The endpoint will be /ABI/properties, and we're ready to send it. And right here, you'll find the property that we just created. Now the next piece of data we should add inside our response right here are the property characteristics. So let's navigate back to our property resource, because we do need to add it somewhere right here. So let's define a new member right below our attributes, because we cannot, well, you can technically add your relationship in here, but it's not best practice. And let's say that we want to add characteristics right here, which will be equal to another array. Now there are two ways on how you could fill your characteristics. We could either pass every column as key value pass right here, just like above, or we could create a new resource which will build the property characteristics, which we can then call right here. And I'm honestly more of a fan of that. So let's navigate to the CLI and let's say PHP artisan make me a new resource named characteristics resource. Now let's navigate back to PHP Storm, open our characteristics resource. Let's change up the toArray method to an array, where we're simply going to add the price, the bedrooms, we have the square feet, we have the price per square feet, then we have the property type, and finally we have the status, which is this status. Now you might wonder how we get our characteristics resource inside our properties resource, which is pretty straightforward, because we simply need to say, well, get me a new characteristics resource. This doesn't work yet, because we do need to pass in the characteristics as a parameter. And this needs to be done through a relationship, because we need to access this, so basically the model, characteristic. Now this, basically this keyword right here, is the property model. So once we define the relationship, we can simply access the characteristic method right inside of our model. So let's actually do that. So let's scroll up. Let's open our models and let's open the property model. Right here, we're going to define a new public function called characteristic. And the reason why it's singular is because one property has one characteristic and not more. Relationship is basically return. This has one, and what it has is a property characteristic model class. Now this characteristic method is basically the method or the line that we're adding right here through the this keyword. Now before we can test it out, let's add some data inside our property characteristics table. So let's say that the property ID is number 1. The price is 100,000. Bedrooms is 2. Bedrooms 2. Square feet is just a random number. Property type is 1. So basically the enum key. The status is 2. Created at, updated at, and let's submit it. All right, we have a new row inside our database. And let me actually clean up all the tabs that I have open, which is pretty annoying. All right, yes. So let's navigate back to Postman. Let's create a new, let's save the request and let's close off all the requests that we have right here as well. Open the get all properties, send the request again. Right here, you'll find our new property with the ID. It has the attributes and it also has the characteristics. Now the characteristics will represent the characteristics where the property ID from the properties table is equal to the column property ID on the property characteristics table. So let me show that to you. So we have our property, which has a property ID, which we're using on the property characteristics table right here. What's left? We should also make sure that we add the broker that is related to one specific property resource. So let's say that we want to add a section for our broker. We don't need a relationship for it, since our property table has a foreign key constraint of broker ID. So what we actually could do is defining a new variable at the top called broker, set it equal to the broker model, chain defined method, and we're gonna find this broker ID. And based on our broker model that we have right here, we could simply say, well, the name of the broker, get me the address of the broker, and also get me the phone number. Once we navigate to Postman, perform our request one more time, scroll down, you'll see that we found the broker as well. I think that we have built up our resource correctly right now, and it's time to focus on the other methods inside our properties controller. The second method is the store method, and once again, I want to replace the request object with a custom request. So let's navigate to the CLI, and let's say PHP artisan make me a new request called store property request. Let's navigate back. Let's open our store property request, change the return statement of the authorized method to true. Then we have our rules, and I'm actually going to cut out this part where I'm going to add the rules because there are tons of them from the properties and the properties characteristics table. As you can see, it's a complete list. Let's navigate back to our properties controller. We're ready to replace our request object with a store property request, but we can then use our request object to validate incoming data. Once the request has been validated, we need to make sure that we create a new property object and set it equal to the property model, which allows us to create a new property by passing in an array, passing in the broker ID, which will come from the request broker underscore ID. We have the address, we have the listing type, we have the city, we have the description, and we have the build underscore year, which is equal to the request build underscore year. Now this doesn't add any data inside the characteristics table, so we need to make sure that we do that as well. And we need to make a separate call for that right below of it. And we don't need to make a call to the property characteristics table. We can simply use our property object, chain the characteristics relationship method, and chain the create method to it. Inside the create method, we're going to pass in an array where we're going to add key value pairs of the data inside the characteristics table by saying property ID, which will come from the property that we have created right above right here. Then we have the price, which comes from the request price. The bedrooms, request bedrooms. The bathrooms comes from the request bathrooms. We have the square feet, which comes from the request square feet. We have the price per square feet, which comes from the request price underscore SKFT. Now let me change the typo right here. We have the property underscore type, which is equal to the request property underscore type. And we have the status, which is the request status. Now, once a new property has been created, we are going to return that specific resource by saying return new properties resource. And we're going to pass in the property that we have created up here. Now there's no need to return the property characteristics that we have right here, because that will be grabbed through the relationship that we have defined. So let's navigate back to Postman. Let's duplicate our latest request. Let's rename it to create new property. The URI will be /properties. It's going to be a post request because we're going to persist data. And here comes the most difficult part, because we need to fill in, well, let me make this a little bit smaller, all the keys. And I'm actually going to cut this part out. I'll see you back once it's done. All right, I have added all key value pairs. So take a look, copy it, and let's click on send. And I have an error. The zip code must be a number. My bad. Right here, let's add a random number. And the price per square feet is a typo. Send it again. You will see that a new property has been created where the ID is equal to 2. We have the attributes, we added the characteristics, and we added the broker as well. The next method is the show method, which is once again a pretty simple one. We're going to replace the ID with a property model, and we're going to create a property object. And then we can return a new properties resource, and we're going to pass in the property object. We can navigate back to Postman. We could duplicate our route. We could rename it to show one property. We can make it a get request. Oops, not a view request. We're going to show the property where the ID is, let's say, equal to 2. Once we submit it, you'll see that we got the data where the property ID is equal to 2. Now the update method will be a little bit different. Let's navigate back and let's scroll down right here. And let's start off by replacing the argument ID to the property model again and a property object. Now through our property object, we have access to the update method where we could basically say, well, update only the following fields. Let's say the broker ID, the address, the listing underscore type, the city, the zip code, the description, the build underscore year. Now the same thing needs to happen for the characteristics, but this time in the same exact way. So through our property object, we have access to the characteristics relationship, which gives us access to the where method. We're going to update where the property ID is equal to the property ID coming from the request with a comma. Then we can chain the update method. And what we're going to update is once again the request only, where we have the fields property underscore ID, the price, bedrooms, bathrooms, the square feet, the price per square feet, the property type, and also the status. Once that is done, we're going to return a new properties resource with our updated property. So let's test it out in Postman again. Let's save it, duplicate the request. It's taking some time. All right, let's rename it to update one property, where the ID is equal to 2. The method is put. The body, well, let's uncheck a couple fields right here because we're simply going to update one field, which will be the address of, let's say, updated address. Now, once we submit the data, you'll see that we have updated the property where ID is equal to true, and we have set the address equal to updated address. The last method is the destroy method, which is once again probably one of the easiest one where we have to do something. First, going to replace our ID argument with the property model, object property. Through our property object, we have access to the delete method, and then we can return a response, chain the JSON, where we have a key value pair. The first one is again a success, where we're going to say true. Then we have a message, which will say property has been deleted from database. Let's test it out, which is the last request. So let's duplicate it, rename it to delete one property. The method will be delete to the property /2. Once we send it, you'll see that the property has been deleted from our database. Now let's make sure that unauthenticated users can only see one specific property or all properties, which needs to be done once again inside our api.php file, where we could simply duplicate our API resource of brokers, change the endpoint to properties, and we could also remove the public API resource route, duplicate the two public brokers routes, paste it down below, change it to properties, and one single property by ID. The controller will be the properties controller, which we can copy for both, and also the one inside our protected route. If we navigate back to Postman, click on send, you'll see that we are unauthenticated, and even if we try to create one, you'll see that we're still unauthenticated. Now this was it for this tutorial, where we have created a property listing API where we could show, update, create, and destroy properties and brokers. Obviously, you can extend this API as much as you want. For the sake of this tutorial, I decided to limit it down a little bit. If you want to see me add more data inside our API or do something with it inside a front-end framework, please let me know in the comment section down below. Once again, I'm working on a databases and Eloquent course which I will publish on Udemy. If you want to stay updated, make sure that you are subscribed on YouTube and follow me on Twitter and Instagram. This was it for this video. If you do like my content and you want to see more, hit that like button, and if you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.